Welcome to this presentation on import profiles and patron-driven acquisitions. My name is Carrie Bartels, and I'm a trainer in Ex Libris North America. During this session, we'll talk about patron-driven acquisitions. So we'll talk about what it is, how to set it up, and how to run it using import profiles. Before viewing this presentation, it is recommended that you view the sessions that are listed here. In particular, we'll be talking about repository and new order import processes in relation to patron-driven acquisitions. So it's important to have some background on the import processes by viewing specifically the resource management session on importing bibliographic records and the acquisitions session on importing bibliographic records with embedded order data. In order to work with patron-driven acquisitions and the import profiles that are related to it, you must have an acquisitions-related role of either a purchasing operator or purchasing manager. The key objectives for this session are to not only understand the patron-driven acquisitions general process, but also be able to configure PDA profiles and run PDA processes. So let's begin with some background on patron-driven acquisitions and what it is. In these days of tight budgets, libraries, of course, need to invest in collections that are used. And the best predictor of usage is sometimes the user. So patron-driven acquisitions can make a lot of sense in this case. Patron-driven acquisition, and it's known as PDA in ALMA, represents an agreement for a vendor to send electronic resources to an institution that may be of interest to the institution. These candidate resources, and typically these are ebook titles, are imported as a repository file into ALMA and then published to the discovery layer, in other words, Primo, to be accessed by patrons. Accessing the candidate resources by patrons is monitored by the vendor. And if a candidate ebook is used, then an automated purchase is created. And usage can be a predefined threshold. So for example, that a certain number of users have to access an ebook in order to create an automated purchase. So going a little bit deeper into the PDA process, let's take a look at an ebook example. Candidate ebook records are loaded into the ALMA repository, and this includes the ebook URLs. ALMA then publishes the ebook candidates to the discovery tool, in other words, Primo. Users find and use the ebooks in Primo. And based on the use of a candidate ebook, it can trigger an automatic purchase of the ebook. If an ebook is purchased, the vendor can deliver the PO via embedded order data file and can invoice via EDI. If an ebook is not purchased due to low usage or perhaps no usage, the ebook is then removed from the repository and removed from Primo also. So now that we've talked about what PDA is, let's talk about what's needed to configure it in ALMA. The first thing that we need is a PDA profile. And the profile includes three things. First of all, general information about the PDA agreement with the vendor. And this includes how many times an ebook has to be accessed in order to constitute a purchase of it. Secondly, it consists of a repository profile. And this is an import profile that will load candidate ebooks to the repository. And then lastly, it has a new order or embedded order data, EOD profile. And that's an import profile that will create the purchase order lines for ebooks that were used by patrons. And we'll go through each of these items, all of which are accessed, though, from the ALMA main menu in the Acquisitions column. Under Advanced Tools, you'll see a link for patron-driven acquisition. And let's take a live look at this next. So from the ALMA menu, under the Acquisitions column, if I scroll down, under Advanced Tools, here's the link for patron-driven acquisition. In order to create a PDA profile, we click on the Add PDA button. And this gives us a blank PDA profile that we can start filling out. I'm actually going to show you a completed profile, so I'm going to click on Cancel. If we have existing PDA profiles already set up, and we do have a couple already set up here, we can click on Edit from the Actions button, and we can edit the profile as needed. So we'll take a look at this YBP PDA profile. So Actions Edit. And this is the general information that makes up the PDA agreement with the vendor. So we give the profile a name, and we give it a code also. And then for the status drop-down, there are 4 options: active, canceled, draft, and paused. And we'll talk more about paused in just a few minutes. In order to continue with the PDA process, the status has to be active. We also indicate the vendor for which the PDA profile is being created. And then we have a start date and an end date for the PDA program. And note that of these 2 dates, only the start date is required. The access threshold field, this is the number of access requests that users make for the electronic resource upon which the institution agrees to purchase the resource. The budget threshold that you see here, this is the maximum amount of money that the institution is willing to pay for electronic resources after the access threshold has been reached. And this is just informational only. ALMA will not prevent resources from being accessed, even if the money threshold or the budget threshold, as we see here, has been reached. The alert percentage works in tandem with the budget threshold. So when the PDA usage exceeds the alert percentage that's indicated in this field, and this is the alert, or the percentage rather, of the budget threshold. So when it reaches that percentage of the budget threshold, an email notification is sent to a contact person, and that contact person is identified here in the contact field. And then we have the license field, and this is if you want to associate an electronic resource license with the PDA profile. You also have tabs for attachments and notes, just as you would see in many other places in ALMA. So I'll go ahead and click on the Save button. So after you create and save the PDA profile, you will then see under the Actions button a link called Manage PDA Profiles. And you'll only see that link if the profile has been saved. So from this point, we will go ahead and click on Manage PDA Profiles. And when we click on that link, we'll see 2 types of PDA-related imports, a repository import and a new order import. You'll want to edit each of these import profiles just to make sure that they're set up correctly for your use. And so we'll start with the repository import first. So Actions, Edit. The repository import profile is used to define details for how to load or import candidate ebooks to your institution's repository. And you're just going to want to make sure that each of the tabs that you see here are configured correctly for your use. Just looking at each of these very briefly, the Profiles tab, or Profile Details tab, is used to indicate the profile name, as we see here. We can indicate a description of the profile, as well as other details about how to access the file that will be imported. Normalization and validation, that's used to normalize and validate candidate records. The Match Profile tab, this is used to match candidate records to existing catalog records. For the Set Management Tags tab, here you'll want to review the Suppress Records from Publish or Delivery checkbox. And you'll want to make sure this checkbox is unchecked or not selected in order to publish the candidate ebooks to Primo. And then the last tab that we see here is the Inventory Information tab. And this is used to map inventory information to ALMA based on how it's coming from the import file. Now just a couple of notes about this tab. You may want to create a local electronic collection and use this as the portfolio type when you are importing resources into ALMA. This will organize the imported records into one collection just for ease of maintenance. So you'll see here that as the portfolio type, I've selected part of an electronic collection. And then what I did is I created a local collection, and I listed that here or selected that for the electronic collection that these imported records will be a part of. Additionally, in this tab, you can define other mappings between the imported data and the settings in ALMA, such as where to extract the URL. Also, you can indicate where to extract various notes fields. So, for instance, if there's an internal description note field in the import file. Also, as I scroll down here, we'll see there's an opportunity to extract an authentication note or perhaps a public note. If the notes don't exist In the import file, you can decide if you want to use a default note, and you can indicate that here. As we scroll down, you'll see a license field, and this is where you can indicate or associate a license with these resources that are being imported. And then finally, you'll see this Activate Resource checkbox. And this is where you can decide if you want the electronic resources that are being imported to be activated as soon as they are imported. Also, I'm just going to scroll back up here and talk about the Delete or Deactivate Portfolios checkbox. You also have the option through the PDA import repository import process to delete records by selecting this checkbox. So when you select that checkbox, any records that are in the import file that have the letter D, as in delete, in position 5 of the leader can be deleted. So just a note, though, that if the record has a PO line connected to it, it will only be deactivated, not deleted in that case. The other thing I will mention is if you choose to import records as standalone portfolios by selecting under portfolio type standalone rather than part of an electronic collection, the form will be extended with 2 additional fields. First of all, there's a new field that will display for extracting the interface name, and then you can indicate also a default interface name. So those 2 new fields will display if you select standalone as your portfolio type. At this point, I'm going to click on Cancel, and that's going to take us back to our PDA import profiles. And let's take a look at the second PDA profile, which is for new orders. So under Actions, I will click on Edit. So this is for importing new orders that have embedded order data. So like we did with the previous repository import profile that we just looked at, you'll just want to review each of these tabs to make sure that the information is configured correctly. In particular, you'll want to check the PO line information tab, just to make sure that everything is mapped correctly based on the embedded order data information that's provided by the vendor and how it's mapped to ALMA for our order details so that the PO line can be created in ALMA. I'll click on Cancel again. This takes us back to our list of imports for the PDA program. Lastly, don't forget to activate your repository import profile as well as your new order import profile. They will be in a draft status up until that point, and you can activate them by clicking on the check mark in the active column, and that turns the check mark yellow, meaning it is activated. Or, as an alternative, by clicking on in the import profile itself under Actions Edit. In the Active drop-down here, we can set this to True. And when we do that and click on Save, that will activate the import profile as well. So a couple of different ways to activate these import profiles. It's actually not mandatory to run the new order import. If you've agreed on other ways of handling the purchase part with the vendor, you may decide to leave this import profile unactivated. And I'm going to click on the back button, and this takes us back to our PDA list of profiles. So let's go back to the slides. So now that we have the PDA profile and associated import profiles established, let's talk about how to run the PDA process. And let's go back to ALMA. Now, because we have activated the import profiles that are associated with the PDA profile here, we will now see 2 new links appear in the Actions menu: Import Repository and Import Orders. So these links did not appear previously. So now that we've activated both of those import profiles, they do appear now in the Actions button for the Actions menu for this particular PDA profile. The first step is we need to run the repository import. So we do that by clicking on the Import Repository link. This allows us to upload the file of candidate ebooks and then run the import process. And you'll also be able to monitor the import process from there just to make sure it completes successfully. Now, going back to the slides for a moment. After the repository import is run, candidate records will then be published to Primo so that users can discover them. Now, once an ebook has been accessed, or when the access threshold that we indicated in the PDA details screen is reached, it will trigger an order. The vendor at that point may provide you with an EOD file, an embedded order data file for ebooks that were accessed. At that point, you would then run for the PDA profile, under Actions, New Order Import, and you'll do that by clicking on Import Orders. And that will create the order information, so in other words, PO lines in ALMA. Just a quick word on automated purchasing. You may remember from the acquisitions day-to-day session that purchase order lines could be automatically created using embedded order data. And that's what we're doing with the PDA new order import process. And we can apply rules so that the POs are automatically approved, sending the PO to the vendor automatically. We can also apply that automated approval and purchase process to the purchase of candidate ebooks. I just wanted to mention that at this point. At the end of the PDA program, and the end of the program could mean that the timeline, so in other words, the end date on the PDA details screen was reached, or the budget exceeds or is about to exceed the monetary threshold, the repository at that point can be cleaned up so that any candidate records or ebooks that were not accessed and were not purchased are removed from the repository. And we can do this from the Actions button for the PDA profile. So Actions, and then you'll see here, as I've indicated in this box, we have some other options as well. Pause. You can use this, for example, if funds for a PDA program are entirely expended. Pause will suppress all bibliographic records that were already loaded for this PDA program but not yet purchased, and prevent new bibliographic records from being loaded for this particular PDA profile or PDA program. Terminate, the next option, sets the end date to the current date and will terminate the program at that point. Cleanup checks that the end date was passed, and it cleans, or in other words deletes, any ebooks that were not used or not purchased from the repository. And then lastly, cancel. We'll set the end date to the current date in order to terminate the program, and we'll also do cleanup to delete ebook records that were not used or purchased. And then it sets the PDA profile status to canceled. So that brings us to the end of this session. So just to summarize, we covered the patron-driven acquisition general process, so you have an understanding of how the PDA process works in ALMA. We looked at what is required to configure PDA, which is creating a PDA profile with details about the agreement with the vendor. Secondly, updating the PDA repository import profile as needed, as well as updating the new order or embedded order data import profile. And then lastly, we looked at how to run the PDA processes using those import profiles. For more details on patron-driven acquisition and import profiles, you can consult the ALMA Acquisitions Guide and the ALMA Resource Management Guide, both of which can be accessed using the online help within ALMA, or they're also on the Ex Libris Documentation Center. Thanks for viewing this presentation.